Hello, my name is Dr. Drew V. Moffitt.
And the topic today is a COVID-19 vaccine. Will it be worth waiting for? In previous videos, we talked about, is COVID-19 worse than the common flu? And what is herd immunity, and can we just rely on that? The answer to the question posed in the first video was, no, COVID-19 is not worse than the common flu because it has a lower infection fatality rate, which is the number of people infected with the virus that die from that infection. But yes, it is worse in that it is much, much more infectious. We talked about the R0, which means the number of people an infected person infects. In the second video, we explained that herd immunity is people who become immune from getting the infection, and that we can't just rely on that because too many people would die waiting to achieve disease extinction by herd immunity. Well, clearly then the answer is that we need to wait for a vaccine, right? Well, to understand that a little bit better, let's look at flu extinction with a vaccine. So again, we're looking at this number we've seen before where we need to achieve immunity of 67 million people, right? Well, let's look at the number of people infected in the 2018-2019 season, or last year. That was 35 million people, right? Well, that means that we would need to vaccinate 41 million people in order to achieve that 76 million people needed to achieve disease extinction, right? Well, what does it take to really do that? Vaccination immunity is the efficacy of the vaccine multiplied by uptake, or the number of people that receive the vaccine. Well, the first question we need to ask is, how effective will a vaccine be? Well, it is most important, obviously, for the elderly, right? But unfortunately, vaccines are typically much less effective in the elderly. For example, for the flu, only 41.8 to 69.1% of elderly vaccinated people develop antibodies to the high-dose flu vaccine for the elderly. They use a high-dose flu vaccine because the normal vaccine still doesn't produce even that amount of immunity. And then for the general population, the flu vaccine ranges widely in effectiveness from 10% to 60% depending on the year. Now let's talk about uptake. Uptake is the percentage of people in the population that actually receive the vaccine when it's available. Bottom line, you have to take it first, right? Well, for the flu vaccine, vaccine uptakes are very low. This graph shows various countries and their uptake rates for receiving the vaccine in the population age 65 and up. Well, in the United States, we do pretty good, but still, it's only 67.5%. Now, I find this slide very fascinating. This shows uptake rates for the swine flu or the H1N1 vaccine. So I don't know if you remember, but back then, it was a big deal. Initially, at least, we had the same feelings about the H1N1 pandemic as we're having about the COVID-19. And so there was a lot of interest in getting this vaccine and everybody taking it to be protected. Well, when it finally came out and it was available, this is the percent of people that actually took it despite all of that interest. The rates are still pretty low, really not much different than what it is in a regular flu season. So, what kind of uptake do we need to extinguish the flu with the help of a vaccine? Well, in this example, we were needing a vaccination immunity of around 41 million. Vaccination immunity is the efficacy times the uptake. Well, we can calculate the uptake by taking the vaccination immunity and dividing by the efficacy. Let's assume that the efficacy in this particular example is 45%. That means that the uptake would need to be 28% of the population, or around 92 million people. Well, how would the existence of a new vaccine against COVID-19 help?
Well, first let's look at an optimistic example. Let's assume the effectiveness of the vaccine is 90%, which is really good. And let's assume an uptake of 80%, which is better than it has been in the United States for many years. Well, that would result in 72% of the population being protected from the existence of a vaccine. Well, now let's look at a more realistic example. Let's assume that a new vaccine against COVID-19 has an effectiveness of 70%, which is still better than the flu vaccine usually is. And let's assume that the uptake is 70%, which is still better than the flu vaccine usually is. Well, that would mean that only 49% of the population would be protected as a result of having a new COVID-19 vaccine. Well, let's see how the presence of this kind of a vaccine against COVID-19 would actually help with extinction of COVID-19. Well, remember that we already calculated that in order to achieve COVID-19 extinction, we would need around 273 million people immune. Well, as of the making of this video, there was about 64 million people currently infected. That would mean that the needed vaccination immunity, or the number of people to achieve immunity because of a vaccine, would need to be around 209 million. Well, remember our formula for uptake is vaccination immunity divided by efficacy, and we're using an efficacy estimate of 70%. Well, that would mean that we would need to vaccinate 298 million people, or 90% of the U.S. population, for this to work for COVID-19 extinction. That's a number that is very hard to achieve. So, is it worth waiting for a vaccine against COVID-19? Well, if we need 90% of the U.S. population to get the vaccine in order for it to work, probably continuing restrictions and waiting for a vaccine is not an answer. Now, some people say that not that many people will need to be vaccinated because as you are waiting for a vaccine, more people will become infected, so that when you have the vaccine, less people will need to be vaccinated. Well, you need to remember that for every 10,000 more people infected, 5 more people will die. So, what is the answer? Well, first of all, I want to say I am definitely not anti-vaccine. I get a flu vaccine every year. I tell my patients to get a flu vaccine every year. I tell my patients that they should get a vaccine to rubella and to chickenpox if my tests show that they are not immune. So I think vaccines are good and they're important, but in the context of what's happening now, we have to think about their timing and what they really mean. If you want an answer to this situation, first watch this video, A Tale of Two Cities, how we can open up the U.S. economy immediately and why we can. Well, the point here is that vaccines take time and should take time. Because we think that that's our only solution, we are rushing to create a vaccine, which may be possible given new technology in vaccine creation. But I've seen movies about how they drop out of warp speed and encounter an unanticipated asteroid belt. I've also seen movies how they introduce vaccines to save the world and end up destroying the world and have a Omega Man kind of a situation. So what we need is something that will provide a solution to keep the economy going while we take the appropriate time to create the best vaccine possible. So what we need is a bridge to a vaccine. We need something that can either prevent infected people from infecting others and is available now to everyone, and or something that protects us from getting infected with the COVID-19 virus, but will be available significantly before a vaccine. What's available now that can prevent infected people from infecting others is a simple homemade face mask. More importantly, what we need is something to protect us from getting infected with the COVID-19 virus, but will be available sooner than a vaccine. What we need are N95 masks. In my previous video, I show that the most vulnerable population to the coronavirus are the people aged 65 and over. What we need then is for the government to supply to all people greater than or equal to 65 an N95 mask. Well, what would something like that look like? The population age 65 and older in the United States is estimated to be about 49 million. The pre-COVID-19 price for an N95 mask was less than $2. So the total cost to protect all elderly in our population for 1 month would be about $1 million. Well, so far, the stimulus packages to date have been $2.2 trillion plus $0.484 trillion. Well, in retrospect, it looks like the purpose of the government shutdown was to protect the elderly at a cost of about $3 trillion. Well, this approach would cost only 0.0037% of what we will spend to repair the damage caused by trying to protect this same population. So, I know what you're saying. How can we possibly distribute 50 million masks to the population age 65 and older? Well, probably a lot easier than we can vaccinate that same population. Now, we can't do that now because we haven't prepared appropriately. But with appropriate guidance, we can probably ramp up our manufacturing capabilities to be able to supply 50 million N95 masks a month to this population. Well, how do we do that? Well, this is an N95 mask. It is small enough to fit into an envelope. A significant portion of this population get a Social Security check every month. We simply put that in with that check and mail it out to them. They then use that mask for a month under a CDC-approved extended use reuse protocol, which can extend the use of an N95 mask up to a month. We therefore are immediately protecting the most vulnerable population, while the general population can go to work and, if necessarily, under a universal masking protocol using simple face masks to protect them at work. In summary, we can protect our most vulnerable population with N95 masks while we wait for a vaccine. That's probably easier than vaccinating that population anyway. We can't do that now because of poor preparation, but we can probably get our production up to speed much more quickly than have a vaccine ready. We simply mail that to them, and it's used under a 1-month extended use protocol. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you did, please share it with somebody, and be safe.